Salutations, and we are back with another exciting presentation, this time of research paper. It is not part 3 of Moscow deaths, only because of the amount of information that I've received recently from some of you of this channel in regards to more deaths that happened between the years of 2018 and 2022. So I want to bring all that information together in a comprehensive way and with integrity before I show that to you. Therefore, this research paper is based on co-offending. Co-offending and how that increases the violence when a crime is committed. We'll also look into a little with our gal, Ann Burgess, who is an author in a manual. And this manual is used to look at these types of crimes. Particularly, the chapter we're going to look at is crimes committed by groups. More specific, murders committed by groups. At this time, I want to speak about, just for a moment, about myself and this channel and where I will be going with it. For the past few weeks, I have been working on a website where I can do videos and chat. Many of you have mentioned that your comments have been taken down by YouTube because there is censorship with YouTube. And when you use their platform, you have to follow their rules. With that being said, I am now able to collect donations from you. If you like to reward me for the amount of time and energy and validity that I put towards this channel, please do so, and I will also use those donations towards equipment, also software to help with certain aspects of this case, as well as with better sound, because some of you have mentioned you can hear me doing laundry, and that just tickles me because I have all the doors shut so you can't hear, but somehow you still hear. Even though my mic, I put no background noise, it still picks it up, which Linda Lane I just think of when I would see those comments. With this website, I'm able to do other type fun things. For example, there's a calendar where I can do like a consultation or maybe even a small lecture. If you want a reading done of your choice, either through a research topic of your choosing that could be pertaining to this case or your own personal, for your own personal knowledge that you would like, or even on a different case that's going on that I'm not covering. And I can present that to you in video form like I do now, or up to your choosing. I could do a small group, like a little small, like a lecture group for a fee, that readings would be for a fee, and I'm open for suggestions as well as other types of reading. Even it could be a chapter in a textbook that you have a hard time with, and sometimes someone else reading it out loud to you with a different knowledge base and perspective can help you understand it more. So my videos will be on this website. They will be on YouTube, but just at a later date, only because I'm finding more that my channel is being reported, as well as having other YouTubers, they see the weight of my work. Instead of them doing the work, they just take from my channel and say it's theirs. And they take away the most important aspect, which is the victimology aspect, which is what my channel is based on. So in order to keep the integrity of this work, I feel the way to go is a website. And we'll see how it goes. Let me know in the comments what you think. So let's move on to the research. And I probably should turn that off so I don't get any other messages about my hair care. So here we are, Crime Classification Manual. And as you see, we have our gal, Ann Burgess, Crime Classification Manual, a standard system for investigating and classifying violent crime. So here we're just going to look at Chapter 10, which is just 2 pages we'll be looking at, because before I go forward, This is for educational purposes only, and I will be using adult language, adult words, adult topics, because in order to respect the victims, you have to say what happened to them out loud. And part of the reason why these are taboo subjects is because secrets keep you sick, and it causes shame and guilt. And when you don't say what happened to them out loud, it gives more power to the perpetrators, because they are aware that there is a lot of shame and guilt behind these acts, and that keeps everyone quiet, meaning the perpetrator and the victim. So we'll be looking at specifically more the group cause homicide and cult, not so much the extremist homicide of political and religious aspects or group excitement, because it does not pertain to this case. So group cause homicide. Group cause homicide pertains to two or more people with a common ideology that sanctions an act committed by one or more of its members that result in death. This category is divided into cult murder, extremist murder, paramilitary extremist murder, and hostage extremist murder, and group excitement homicides such as a gang attack fed by its own momentum and peer reinforcement that escalates into murder. So we have talked about cults before in a research paper, and we also have talked about peer victimization within fraternities and sororities. And what we learned that if you identify yourself as an autonomous person with your own individual identity, you're going to have an increased likelihood of peer victimization within your fraternity or sorority. We also talked about this in ritualistic apologies, where the Greek system is aware that the way their system is set up, it breeds the behavior which causes a lot of turmoil and issues, bad behavior, such like hazing. And hazing definitely pertains to two or more people that ends up sometimes resulting into death. So group cause homicide cult, a body of adherents with excessive devotion or dedication to ideas, objects, or persons, regarded as unorthodox or spurious, and whose primary objectives of sex, power, or money are unknown to the general membership, is known as a cult. A cult murder pertains to the death of an individual committed by two or more members of the cult. So, in regards to this case, fraternities and sororities definitely have their ideals of what it means to be part of their fraternity or sorority. They definitely talk about the founders and how they have to respect them and their tradition, the objects with the pins, as well as their hand signals and their crest. Many of us believe that this homicide was two separate occasions with two different groups of offenders in two different locations. Many of us believe that this was not done by a single person who had no connection to the victims per the defense as well as the prosecution, as well as never having any type of violent behavior or violent tendencies prior to this case. So this whole primary objectives of sex, power, and money, I'm not sure about the sex, but the power and money, absolutely, with these fraternities and sororities. We see how they purposely position themselves in the student body as in the politics of the university, as well as get internships through government, such as senators in the state of Idaho. And then they go through the political system to keep that power and control. The money, you have the scholarships, you have their fundraising, and they are associated with large charitable organizations for social status, image, but as well as money too. So a cult member pertains to the death of an individual committed by two or more members of the cult. So defining characteristics in regards to victimology. So occasionally, Occasionally, cult murder is the result of members prying on a random victim, but the prevailing casualty of this type of murder tends to be one who is a member of the cult or on the fringe of membership. So here I think of Kaylee, Maddie, and Xana because, yes, they were part of the Greek system in a sorority, but they were no longer active members, so they were on the fringe. Ethan was a member of his fraternity, Sigma Chi, but he was no longer living there, so he would be technically considered on the fringe. He's not inside the house. Those who were not in the fringe, who are part of the group, were the two survivors, which is Dylan and Bethany. And generally, multiple victims are involved, which is what happened in this case. Crime scene indicators frequently noted. So the crime scene may contain items that are symbolic in the form of unexplained artifacts or imagery. The status of the body is dependent on the purpose of the killing. If it is intended to be a widespread message, there generally will be little to no attempt to conceal the body, which sounds like what happened with this case. Xana was found on the floor lying down with the door open, as well as the door was open for Kaylee and Maddie. We were told in the PCA by Brett Payne that when he walked into the rooms, he could see their wounds. We are told by Kathy Mabott that they were gaping wounds. They were large gaping wounds where you could see the inside of their body cavity. I mentioned prior that I was going to do crime scene staging, but I felt that we should put that on the shelf for right now because this goes with the trajectory of this movement on this channel in regards to part 1 and part 2. A death that is intended to intimidate within the smaller circle of the cult is often concealed through burial, which that I think of Scientology, if you know anything about them. A more organized group usually demonstrates more elaborate body disposal or concealment. There is a prevalence of mass grave sites on the grounds where a cult is based, for example, a farm or rural residences. The crime scene usually exhibits evidence of multiple offenders as well as multiple victims by either a mass or a spree killing, which many of us believe that these are two separate incidences, possibly in two separate areas, and they were brought there afterwards. We are learning that there were multiple weapons used on the victims, and the crime scene was compromised. It was complex, so to speak, but it was mostly compromised because the two survivors who were part of the group did not call 911 until 11:56 and had people come over to the house and walk through the crime scene, which the whole house is considered a crime scene at this point, and spoke to family and friends prior to calling 911. So common forensic findings. The forensic findings most common to this type of homicide involve wounds from firearms, blunt force trauma, and sharp-pointed objects. There may be mutilation of the body as well. Multiple weapons might be seen with a single event, which we just went over. Investigative considerations. The leaders of the destructive cults are often involved with scams and may have a criminal history, which the fraternities and sororities definitely have had a criminal history. Therefore, they are put on hold or they're being suspended because it's a criminal history. However, this may not be the case if the cult is a splinter group of a mainstream conventional religion. In either case, the leadership displays a masterful ability to attract and manipulate people, exploiting their vulnerability. The murder may not have any apparent religious overtones and ritualistic qualities. There may be a message after the killing, especially if it is intended for the public, which many of us believe it was for people to keep quiet, don't talk. The motive is often presented to the General Assembly of the cult as part of the group belief. The leader's motivation, however, will be controlling factor, a macho way to justify the homicide, tighten his control of the group, or eliminate troublemakers or less devoted followers who threatened his authority. So personally, I believe this was about information that was either gathered or found out and was put on ears who they believed were trustworthy ears, but were not. I say this because of the way the wounds were presented, as well as Ethan's wounds. They have a vow of secrecy in regards to like not having a rat or not having a narc. There was many deaths that happened before the 4 that happened, which we went over. It could be knowing information of what had happened to any of them, and that was spoken about. Also, it could be just, we are aware that Kaylee found that missing person and reported it, and that person ended up being found dead in a car submerged in water. And the way the FBI was there as quickly as they were, and some people believe or have found out that they were already there in the first place, which we are also learning in the recent documents about information concealment and possibility, in which Thompson had talked about confidentiality. So are there CIs involved here? And CIs can be arranged from local police department to even a CI in the FBI. So there are many possibilities of what this crime entails. And then we're not going to go through that because that's about the extremist. And the case study that is presented in regards to the cult, it's more about a family with a child involved, and they used firearms. So here is the paper on the compounding effect, how co-offenders exasperate the harm caused by violent offenders. And this was published in 2024 of April. And we have 4 people: Emily Piper, Barack Ariel, Vincent Harriman, and Matthew Bland. Now, this is based out of the UK, but they do use supporting factors of the US as well as Canada. They look more as a network, which that is the fraternities and sororities. It's definitely a network. It's about connections. And many of you have picked up that because of the way these crimes and these hazings are done, it almost gives off a competition, especially between WSU and U of I. So those 3 are from the Institute of Criminology, the University of Cambridge in the UK, Institute of Criminology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and Morneville Applied Research, which is Bowmanville, Ontario. So it's a range of researchers looking at this particular topic. So here is the abstract. To what extent do violent offenders cause harm to victims when they act independently versus when they collaborate with others? Currently, it remains unclear whether co-offending exasperates the degree of violence, partly due to measurement considerations, such as how to account for varying degrees of crime severity. Using police records from Dorset, UK, we compare violent crimes committed by lone individuals to those committed by co-offending networks using a crime harm index. While lone offenders commit the majority of violent acts, those with multiple connections to other violent offenders yielded higher average and total harm scores. Moreover, the severity of offenses is proportional to the scale of the criminal network, with larger violent networks linked to higher crime harm scores. Finally, the propensity for recidivism is greater among co-offender groups compared to lone offenders. So this is perfect in regards to this case. We're talking about Are there co-offenders, which many of us believe, compared to a lone offender, which is the defendant Brian Kohberger? The implications of the compounding effect of co-offending on violence are discussed. Introduction. And this is from the American Journal of Criminal Justice, 2024. So here's the introduction. When violent offenders collaborate and engage in criminal activities together, the potential for harm and the escalation of violence can significantly increase. Group dynamics, competition between individuals, and learned behavior can lead to more violent assaults. Therefore, when multiple individuals engage in violent acts, we can reasonably presume that their shared aggression and destructive tendencies can foster a dangerous symbiotic relationship. The collective nature of their actions may exacerbate the violence and harm inflicted on victims and the community, with potentially important ramifications for violence reduction strategies. However, to date, research quantifying the level of harm caused by violent co-offenders compared to individual offenders is relatively sparse. Lance and Felsen and Lance employed differential classifications of violence by injury, but these were limited in sensitivity as they included only 3 categories: no injury, minor injury, and serious injury. The recent development of more sensitive instruments presents an opportunity to deepen our understanding, a goal this paper seeks to achieve. There is a robust body of scholarship on the phenomenon of co-offending in general, particularly concerning violent crime. Our focus is primarily on networks, which have been identified as transmissive and exasperating. Numerous theoretical frameworks explain these phenomena, ranging from the classic social learning theory, rational choice, denial of responsibility, to the contemporary, which is compounding. The latter framework is a principle of interest to us because it remains fresh and relatively untested, which an especially high potential for violence reduction programs. The current view in that violent perpetrators may be influenced by focused deterrence strategies that target risk-reward models, employing rational choice theory to bring about behavioral changes. However, there are typically more violent offenders than there is capacity to deal with them. Therefore, additions to the arsenal of targeting tools are important considerations and the principal starting point of the study. Looking at co-offending may be a viable approach. This paper presents a novel approach to estimating the exasperation of crime using a crime harm index as opposed to assigning each crime an equal weight or using an insensitive taxonomy dependent solely on injury. Insensitive taxonomy dependent solely on injury. When tallying the numbers of offenses committed by an individual without considering the severity level of each crime committed, there is a risk of miscalculation regarding the degree of risk an offender poses to society. Very true. Equally, categorizing offenders based on the types of crimes they commit also has the potential to mischaracterize the offender. This is because crime severity serves as a function of both the type of offense and the overall number of offenses an individual commits. For example, an offender who has committed multiple common assaults may not be categorized as a high harm offender, as common assaults score relatively low compared to attempted homicides or weapons offenses, even though they may have caused harm multiple times, which is so true because there's an escalation. Once they know they can get away with it, they keep going further and further and further. They just test their boundaries. That's just human nature. They just do it in a harmful, dangerous way, though. Therefore, we utilize a crime harm index, taking into account these nuanced yet critical methodological considerations to assess the compounding effect of co-offending on violence. This study aims to provide insights into the dynamics of violence among offenders, emphasizing the significance and impact of co-offending on violent behavior. The findings, both in terms of substance and methodology can contribute to our understanding of violence transmission within co-offending groups, highlighting that violence contagion is directly connected to group dynamics, which, hello. Literature review. I mean, that just shows with hazing, that is a group effort. That is not just one person doing that or two people doing that. That is three or more who are involved with the hazing. And then we learned in another research paper with hazing typologies, you had the educator, the fool, and legacy, where the fool was the person who would just themselves, in order to show their allegiance to the group, will go beyond their boundaries of whatever it is, just to show themselves, to prove themselves. And the group surrounding them allows it to happen because, well, he's doing it, so it's okay, which no one steps in and is like, okay, relax. And then you have those on legacy who feel the need to possibly one-up their family member who was part of that fraternity or sorority at one time or another. So literature review. Felsen contended that when criminals assemble, they are highly likely to exchange information, skills, and trusted accomplices across criminal networks. These interactions, Felsen argued, are likely to result in the commission of a criminal act. In simple terms, collaborating facilitates behavior that acting alone does not, or facilitates behavior that acting alone does not. A premise supported by a range of empirical evidence. Numerous hypotheses and fully developed theories support this phenomenon, and we review this body of work below. Definitions of co-offending. Reese described three types of career criminals: those who commit crimes alone, those who commit crimes with others, two or more individuals, and those who commit crimes both alone and with others. These types have been classified as single offense, co-offense, and mixed offense criminals. To meet the co-offending definition, Reese emphasized that individuals must jointly commit a crime and be present at the same time. And now my printer is going off for no reason. Tremblay, however, noted that this definition excludes the larger group of individuals who may have supported the primary offenders before, during, and after the criminal act. Lance and Hutchinson expanded on this definition to include individuals who assist in the commission of any offense by participating both directly and indirectly. Therefore, some definitions of a co-offender include a broader network of accomplices who can be relied upon for the criminal act to occur. So I'm thinking like Dylan and Bethany, unfortunately. We hear that they heard what was going on and did nothing. They saw a stranger in their house and did nothing. Dylan calling Kaylee to come be her +1 for a formal when she was not living there at the time. Officer Rosendahl, who takes a picture of Kaylee's ID. Officer Rosendahl and accomplice at Taylor Lane when the crimes are being committed. Moving on. The definition of a co-offender is not just a matter for scholars, and how people may commit crimes in groups of two or more is also an issue for law enforcement. In the UK, a principal offender is defined as the individual who commits the actual crime. When two or more individuals jointly commit a crime, they are referred as joint principals. A secondary offender is defined as an individual who aids or encourages the commission of the substantive offense but does not commit the actual crime. So that could include a lot of people surrounding those four at the time that this happened. Theoretical frameworks. For the co-offending to occur, individuals must be willing to collaborate, considering the advantages and disadvantages of such engagement, and this information must be accessible to other prospective co-offenders. When evaluating the cost of co-offending, an individual may assess whether similar benefits could be obtained by acting alone, along with the likelihood of apprehension if they are involved with another person. Co-offending can thus be a liability, and researchers have found that the higher the number of offenders involved in a crime, the greater the likelihood of apprehension and betrayal. Still, this decision to co-offend with whom and with how many accomplices reflect a rational choice. And I guess we could possibly even include this with those who haze and it goes badly, which I believe that these 4 new information that should not have been known, or it was known information and it was spoken about, because the way these crimes were committed and shown of the victims, it screamed, keep quiet. And the severity of the wounds, also to keep quiet. With the way that Ethan's legs were, some say narc, some say rat. Was it because of the information that was known? Some people believe that narcotics were involved, which is a possibility. There have been syndicates where fraternities were really into it and they had a large distribution. Or it could even be a RICO type case, because FBI was there before the crimes even happened, allegedly. But they were heavily involved, very heavily involved. We learned that Kaylee reported a missing person, and that missing person ended up being found in a car in the bottom of a body of water. We're just learning now that new information has come out with the documents of the hearing that's coming up soon, which is June 18th, in regards to information that's being censored, that's being hidden, for a possibility of a CI being involved. And CIs can range from a local police department to state to even federal. There are FBI CIs. There's many possibilities with this crime, unfortunately. The suitability of a co-offender must be calculated too. Tremblay highlights 2 key elements when selecting a suitable co-offender: trustworthiness and usefulness. Offenders will either focus on building strong relationships based on trust within smaller networks, or opt for more extensive networks for useful co-offenders. Furthermore, Rearman described how social selection and co-offending converge when offenders associate with one another based on the availability of criminal opportunities. Weaver and Fraser offered a slightly different perspective on social selection, arguing that a group's criminality may be attributed to the socioeconomic disadvantage experienced by its members. They argued that group offending offers members a sense of belonging and respect that they may not achieve otherwise due to their circumstances. This sentiment was echoed elsewhere. In a study involving 298 Canadian inmates, a significant portion of the sample reported being introduced to crime by an influential individual. A Swedish study on youth co-offending involving 22,000 suspects revealed that delinquent behavior was transmitted across youth networks when members shared common beliefs regarding social injustices alongside similar feelings of anger and frustration. These theories are fit to explain violent co-offending as well. In the context of aggression, collaboration among co-offenders may encourage each participant to engage in more extreme acts of aggression, forming the basis of the compounding hypothesis. Acting alongside others can lead to the sense of competition among co-offenders, with each individual attempting to be more brutal or ruthless than the others. Consequently, the act of co-offending may result in a violent feedback loop, as each member of the group feels compelled to assert dominance or seek retribution for perceived slights or betrayals. Retaliation, vengeance, and group disputes may escalate violence levels, which you can definitely see that within these groups of fraternities and sororities. There was a fight in the 2023 with the football team with I want to say it was a fraternity member, but don't quote me on that. Or those football players were in a fraternity and went over to a residence where one person, they got really beat up. So Furthermore, studies in group psychology, including social identity theory and self-categorization, suggest that co-offending may have a desensitizing effect on the individuals involved. Absolutely. When violent offenders collaborate, they may reinforce and normalize violent behavior amongst themselves, like the Greek system. This normalization can further erode inhibitions and morale qualms, making individuals and groups more likely to perpetuate violence. Violent co-offending. Well, Hodgins, Van Mastricht, and Carrington, Stoltzberg and D'Aliso, and Bright et al. Concluded that solo offending represents the most common form of violent offending. A substantial body of empirical research documents the extensive and global prevalence of violent co-offending, especially amongst juveniles. This phenomenon is most prevalent during adolescence and diminishes with age. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sources to support that. Stolzenberg and D'Aliso suggested that young people spend more time in groups than adults, thereby increasing the likelihood of co-offending. However, Zimrig and LaCour challenged these conclusions, arguing that group involvement among all offenders is significant. A more nuanced approach considers the type of offense and co-offending prevalence. It seems that co-offending is less prevalent in violent crimes than in property or market crimes. However, extensive evidence suggests that co-offending relationships and network dynamics may lead to an increase in violence. Tracy et al. Examined the transmission of violence within social networks in 16 studies, revealing that personal and social relationships between victims and offenders of violent crime heightened the risk of violent behavior and victimization. While this study was limited to weapons-related violence in a domestic setting, comparable findings have emerged in other research on violent crime, co-offending, and social networks. Studies on gunshot victimizations in 2 U.S. cities concluded that gang membership and proximity to gang member increased the likelihood of becoming a gunshot victim. Fox et al., I know I say that wrong, but I like to say it that way, found that individuals who are exposed to deviant social networks are more prone to becoming victims of homicide or severe assault, which is Kaylee Goncalves. She got away from that. She graduated early. She got away from it. And then she came back to that university and ends up being massacred with 3 other people. Maddie and Xana were not... Okay, I'm going to... Hold on a second. My battery is running low. So Maddie and Xana were no longer active members of their sorority, but still on the fringe, on the fray, end up being murdered in the home where 2 active members were survivors. I mean, it looks so clear to me, and the way the secrecy is, it's hard not to go in that direction. At that time, that's the direction that we're going. Group size matters. Beyond the question of the prevalence of co-offending, collaborating with others has distinguishing features. In a longitudinal study of adolescents, Conway and McCord found that nonviolent offenders who jointly committed their first offense with a violent offender were more likely to commit serious violent crimes in the future. Absolutely. If they got away with it, they're going to escalate it. In a study on rape, robbery, and homicide offenses, McGloin and Picuro found that a higher number of accomplices increased the likelihood that the first group offense would be a violent crime. This was the case regardless of whether the offenders had a history of violent crime. Bond and Bushman found that violent behavior within adolescent networks is contagious and can propagate through up to 4 degrees of separation. Therefore, comprehending the extent and reach of this behavior necessitates an understanding of the size of both social and co-offending networks, which is why I do connections, dynamics, and timeline. And some comments are like, why are you covering Nevaeh Douglas? Well, because she is definitely within the degree of separation. She's within those groups. She was on campus in the beginning of their freshman year. That's why we learned that Kaylee, because we mostly covered her, had ties to that sorority before she even went to that campus. That's a degree of separation. If Brian Kohberger, the defendant, was with a group of people and this was his first violent crime, according to this, that would make sense. But since he was a lone person doing it without any violent history, is very unlikely, especially when we were told in the beginning by William Thompson that the officers who were covering this case in the beginning believed it was someone who they knew. It was not a random act of violence. First, studies on both violent and nonviolent crime have indicated that the majority of co-offenses are committed by two individuals rather than larger groups. And they use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sources to back up that statement. However, the more offenders an individual associates with, the greater the frequency of violent co-offenses committed. McGloin and Procurel find that larger groups of offenders are more likely to engage in violent acts, particularly in the context of juvenile delinquency. Violent groups offenses had an average of 3.35 offenders per event, whether nonviolent offenses had an average of 2.82 offenders. For each additional offender with whom the individual associates, the expected frequency of violent group offenses increased by 9.6%. Logistic regression models predicting whether an individual's first group offense would be violent indicated that the chances of the first group offense being violent surges by 33% for every additional accomplice presented during the event. This relationship remains significant even when controlling for whether the accomplices have a history of prior violence. And plus, Brian Kohberger is not within this age group. He's a 28-year-old male. He is considered an adult. He's not considered in the medical terms, in late adolescence, which is between the ages of 19 and 23. This relationship remains significant even when controlling for whether the accomplices have a history of prior violence. This is corroborated by studies on firearm ownership, kidnapping, sexual assault, and shootings. It appears that group size impacts perceptions of risk and rewards and deviant behavior more broadly. In a series of experiments conducted with university students, McGloin and Thomas demonstrated a positive relationship between group size and anticipated fun or excitement and social inclusion. However, larger groups resulted in diminished perceptions of responsibility and formal sanctions risks, suggesting an increased propensity towards deviant behavior or group size increases, which is the Greek system. More recently, McGloin explored the concept of opt-out thresholds in criminal behavior, finding that larger group sizes can lead to a higher likelihood of individuals opting out of participation in criminal activities, indicating that group dynamics can function as a disincentive. Specifically, 68% of subjects who reported an opt-in threshold regarding engaging in fights also exhibited an opt-out threshold. McGloin further demonstrated the complex interplay between group size and the decision to participate in or abstain from violent acts, underscoring how group dynamics impact individuals' inclination to fight in various ways. The study provided a nuanced understanding of how the presence and actions of peers within a group can significantly influence an individual's decision-making process regarding violent behavior. Among the 1,852 respondents, 62.5% indicated they would not engage in a fight even if others did, while 18.2% would fight regardless of others, and 19.3% would fight if others fought first. Conversely, among those with an intention to fight, a significant portion, 68%, stated they would cease fighting once 4 to 5 others were involved. This demonstrates a reverse bandwagon effect, which increased group involvement resulted in a decision to stop fighting, which we did go over that in the ritualistic apologies, in that they purposely taught about in those case studies with how there was a large amount of racism going on and how it was important to teach about the sensitivity of it, and how the leaders that were in charge of teaching learned that those who participated in that information were more likely to talk up and speak against it, as opposed to those who didn't go to it, ended up remaining the same. So education does help. It just has to be consistent, and it has to be over a duration of period of time, like a longitudinal type study. It has to go throughout a decade or so and be consistent every year, every semester. I don't know about every semester, but you have to be consistent with it in order to change the culture, to change the mentality. So co-offending group dynamics and their influence on patterns of future crime. Contemporary studies have explored the characteristics and dynamics of co-offending groups with a focus on patterns of future behavior. Meneggi examined the persistent effects of co-offending on future violent behavior among offenders involved in organized crime in Italy, which I've learned with this case that there are fraternities and sororities in Italy as well as France. They are not at the level that it is here in the US, but they are there. Utilizing dynamic random effects probit models, the study analyzed how both solo and co-offending past violent behavior influences the likelihood of future violence. They found that prior violent co-offending has more substantial effect on future violence than prior violent solo offending. Specifically, the average marginal effect of past involvement in violent co-offending increases the probability of future violent offending by 14.2% compared to offenders who did not engage in violent co-offending. Moreover, engaging in violence multiple times doubles the likelihood of committing violence in the future. Absolutely. It's just human behavior. If you're doing that and you're getting away with it, you're going to keep doing it, which is very scary with this case and having the wrong defendant, because the actual people who did it are free. Not only that, the people who are aware of those offenders doing that and getting away with it is going to have them more than likely try it themselves and maybe be involved next time because they know they can get away with it. And with human behavior, it escalates because you keep pushing the boundaries, because it's almost like a drug. When people who are addicted to illegal substances or any substances, even sugar, I've had patients where it got to the point where they would lose body parts because they were not able to change their dietary habits. And that's an addiction where you're losing your limbs because of your eating and not taking care of your daily habits. You're not taking your medication, you're not exercising, you're not doing all those things that are needed. Now, in regards to illegal substances, they have to keep doing them more and more and more because they have a tolerance. It's going to act that way with behavior, violent behavior. A cumulative effect underscores that violence is a persistent behavior with enduring consequences. Conway and McCord also investigated patterns of criminal behavior among juvenile offenders, particularly focusing on the impact of co-offending on the likelihood of committing violent crimes. They demonstrated that non-violent offenders who committed their first co-offense together with violent accomplices face an increased risk of involvement in subsequent serious violent crime. This finding suggests that exposure to violence is a co-offending context that can escalate the severity of criminal behaviors. So in regards of juveniles, we did a paper on peer victimization within fraternities and sororities. So whoever they were in high school, they're going to carry that into their college years. The finding suggests that exposure to violence as a co-offending context can escalate the severity of criminal behavior. Offenders whose first co-offense involved violent accomplices subsequently committed a higher proportion of violent crimes than those not exposed to such violent accomplices. Moreover, exposure to violent accomplices did not heighten a general propensity to crime, as opposed to violence specifically, suggesting that for some individuals, the impact of co-offending with violent accomplices is specific to violent behavior. However, we do not definitively know whether this relationship is causal. It is plausible that certain individuals may induce others to violence, but it is not equally plausible that certain individuals are attracted to violent offenders. Nonetheless, these findings underscore the substantial influence of co-offending, particularly with violent accomplices, on the criminal trajectory of juvenile offenders. The context and companionship in juvenile offenses significantly impact the likelihood and severity of future criminal behavior, especially when you have those young, developed minds, and that's going to change your brain chemistry. More recently, Bright conducted a network analysis of co-offending dynamics using relational hypervent models. The study devolved into the conditional probability of distinct groups of co-offenders engaging in various crime categories over time, providing insights into the versatility and adaptation of criminal behavior within co-offending networks. The research revealed that groups of 2 or more co-offenders are more likely than solo offenders to commit offenses involving more than one crime category. These findings suggest a higher level of criminal versatility among co-offenders than solo offenders. Moreover, Bright illustrated a heterophily effect, the extent to which co-offenders possess varying previous experiences in specific crime categories. A more pronounced heterophily effect was observed for property crimes, while the effect was weakest for violent crimes. This suggests that co-offending groups often comprise both experienced and inexperienced members in property crimes, potentially facilitating the exposure of inexperienced co-offenders to new types of crimes. Nevertheless, the results indicate that offenders are likely to commit offenses that involved crime categories previously committed by their co-offending collaborators. Thus, co-offending groups tend to exhibit homogeneous experiences with the violent crime category. It is improbable that an individual without a history of violent offending will engage in co-offending related to violent crimes, which contrasts with other crime categories such as property crimes. Bright findings support the concept of social contagion, which entails learning new types of crime through exposure to co-offenders. And right now this popped in my head that some people believed that Brian Kohberger and Brett Kopaka knew each other and that they went over to 1122, which that's a theory. I did not jump on that for whatever reason. That could always change, but at this time, no. So if Brian Kohberger knew Brent Kopaka and he had quite the past, we know he had PTSD and he had some runs with the law, he's going to tend to not hang out with someone like that because, one, he has a history and Brian does not, and he's not of that age. And 2, he is getting his PhD in criminal justice, which you don't want to hang out with those that are like that because you're going to be an accomplice of some sort or get in trouble. Now, he did do a paper about those types of crimes. That does not mean he's going to go out on his own. If he did continue his research, a professor is going to be aware. Someone's going to be aware of it. Crime severity and violent co-offending. Lance illustrated the complex dynamics with co-offending groups and how they impact the severity of violent outcomes, highlighting the importance of considering both the composition of co-offending groups and the nature of the victim-offender relationship, and understanding the patterns and severity of violence in criminal incidents. Utilizing NIMBYRS data, which is the National Information Research of Study. I want to say it's through the FBI. Lance reported that incidents involving co-offenders were A, 64% more likely to involve the use of a weapon, B, 31% more likely to result in minor injury, and C, 79% more likely to result in serious injury compared to incidents committed by solo offenders. These findings demonstrate that group offending is associated with more serious crimes and the propensity for more harmful victimization. Moreover, as the size of the co-offending group increases, the likelihood of offense severity also escalates, which I want to say is this case. This is what happened with this case, in my opinion. Each additional co-offender was found to be associated with a 33% increase in the likelihood of weapon use, an 18% increase in the likelihood of minor injury, and 43% increase in the likelihood of serious injury. Moreover, Lance reports that incidents involving groups with a higher proportion of males were approximately 47% more likely to result in serious injuries compared to those involving female groups. The age composition of co-offending groups is also significant. Young adult offenders were more likely than other age groups to be involved in incidents that result in serious injury to victims. This supports the hypothesis that young adult offenders are more likely than other offenders to engage in the significant violence, which is the age group of these college students. The present study. In this study, we aim to address the following empirical inquiries. 1. What are the prevalence and frequency of violent crime among solo or group offenders? Addressing this question requires analyzing not only the number of incidents, but more crucially, identifying escalatory patterns based on the level of harm inflicted on the victim, such as the compounding effect. What is the network structure of co-offending groups, and does crime harm, as opposed to crime count, vary across various types of networks? Answering this question would provide insights into the interconnectedness of violent criminals and the extent of these relationships. What is the propensity for repeated offending and co-offending network of violent offenders? Understanding the conditional probability of further assaults within each study group can inform prevention and crime management policies aimed at addressing violent crime. So here are the methods. This study is set in Dorset, a county on the south coast of England, under the jurisdiction of Dorset Police. The county is largely rural, with a population of 800,000 residents and over 25 million annual visitors. So this is definitely a bigger population than Moscow, Idaho. But Moscow, Idaho has less residents than they do people who are part of the university, which here would be the annual visitors. So this population here in England, they rely on their tourism, whereas Moscow, Idaho relies on the university. And it's rural, just like Moscow is. Data and procedures. The unit of analysis is violent crime offenders in Dorset. To qualify, individuals need only be identified as offenders in police records, regardless of whether they were charged or convicted. Consistent with Tremblay's approach in crimes involving multiple offenders, the individual need not have been present at the scene of the crime. Due to changes in Dorset's crime recording system, a 7-year time series, which is 2015 to 2022, which is 3 years more than what we did, was the maximum period of which data was available. Types of violent crime included in the study are largely based on the Home Office counting rules for violence against a person's offense. The Home Office is the government department responsible for policing in the UK, and the counting rules are national standards for recording crimes in England and Wales. Only 2 types of violent crime offenses were omitted: corporate manslaughter, as the offender is a corporation, and offenses involving death or serious injury in the unlawful driving category. So, as this involves a vehicle and is less about personal violence. Robbery and possession of weapons were included, as both involve some elements of violence. The Home Office crime recording standards stipulate that only 1 crime report should be generated for each crime event, regardless of the number of individuals involved. Consequently, we were able to capture co-offending across all violent crimes recorded by Dorset Police. With each offense, an offender assigned a single unique ID. In this data set, there were 75,097 unique offenses committed by 41,591 unique offenders. Estimating crime and harm. Not all crimes carry equal levels of harm. Therefore, a weighting system is necessary to measure the severity of a crime. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sources to support that claim. However, measuring harm poses a challenge as it can impact a wide array of individuals, such as victims, parents, friends, and families, and groups, including justice systems, communities, and society. This complexity becomes particularly pertinent when assessing co-offending, as multiple individuals participate in the commission of the crime. Traditional crime counting methods treat each incident as carrying equal weight, resulting in a limited understanding of crime issues. Instead of tallying the frequency of various types of crimes, the Cambridge Crime Harm Index, CCHI, aims to quantify the harm that crimes inflict on society. It does not, however, consider aggravating or mitigating circumstances in individual cases. The underlying principle of the CCHI is that a more sensitive measure of crime takes into account both the frequency of crime, such as how many times it occurred, as well as the level of harm the crime category caused, such as severity. For example, a burglary or serious assault inflicts more harm in society than a minor assault, as evidenced by the fact that the punishment for burglary is more severe, such as the prison sentence is longer. This approach has limitations, but the key point lies in the differentiation of severity, which I agree with. For example, and this is on a wide spectrum, people who went to prison for life for marijuana, but then people who molested children or raped women or children end up either just not going to jail or prison or got minor offenses or minor sentences, like a few months. Rarely did you see people of that category get life in prison, except for the Menendez brothers. But that's something totally different. Their parents were well known, so that means something, and they were well connected. So, formally, the CCHI assigns harm scores, quantified in days, to various types of crimes. These scores are based on the minimum length of prison sentence each type of crime would typically incur under English law for first-time offenders without aggravating or mitigating circumstances. The longer the minimum sentence, the higher the score assigned. For instance, a crime that typically results in a 10-year prison sentence would be considered 10 times more harmful than a crime that typically results in a 1-year sentence. The total harm caused by crime in a particular area of time or a time period can then be calculated by adding up the harm scores of all recorded crimes. Thus, the CCHI provides a more nuanced and meaningful assessment of crime's impact, enabling policymakers and law enforcement to allocate resources more effectively and efficiently to address the most harmful crimes. Additionally, it provides a deeper understanding of violence trends over time and within specific locations and individuals. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources to support that. We use this method of violent co-offending networks in the present study. And I agree with that, just because certain areas get more money because of the population. But if you have a specific area where there's a lot of violent crime happening that doesn't have the funding, that's just only going to perpetuate more crime. Statistical techniques. We leverage a combination of statistics on crime count and crime harm to discern patterns of violent solo crime versus co-offending crime in Dorset. To assess the differences in crime counts and crime harm, we employ independent sample t-test as the data distribution justifies this approach. Subsequently, we employ conditional probability to gauge the likelihood of future offenses given prior offenses. Specifically, we calculate an offender's likelihood of committing the next sequential offense based on their commission of a prior offense. Finally, we employ social network analysis to discern patterns of violent offending in Dorset. We construct a one-mode offender-to-offender network based on the unique offenses each offender was involved in. Each of the 41,591 offenders was identified based on their unique ID. A link existed between offenders if they participated in the same violent offense together. We calculated the network density, degree of centrality, and distance of the co-offending network. Network density measures the overall connectedness of the actors within a network and is represented by a coefficient ranging from 0 to 1, with a coefficient close to 1 indicating that offenders often co-offend together. Degree centrally measures the number of unique ties an actor has within their respective network, indicating how many unique co-offenders an actor has. Distance measures the shortest path between two nodes in the network. Data limitations. This study employs violent crime data recorded by the Dorset Police. It does not include data held by other agencies, such as the National Health Service, which treats victims of violent crime. Furthermore, it is unlikely that the study represents all violent crimes committed in Dorset during the period of study, as most crimes are not reported to the police. Very true. This limitation is not unique to the study. Moreover, a national data integrity audit in 2020 reported that Dorset failed to record over 1,900 violent crimes a year. No report taken. Thus, it cannot be assumed that all violent crimes have been captured within the period of study in Dorset. So here are the results, and I'm just going to skim through these. Descriptive statistics. So this is 41,591 distinctive offenders involved in 75,097 violent crime events during the study period, which is 71 months. And there were 41% acts of violence without injury, followed by 32% acts of violence with injury, and 23% incidents of stalking and harassment, and 2% cases of possession of weapon, 1.5% instances of robbery, and 0.5% of homicide. Violence with injury accounted for 80.3% of the overall crime harm based on the crime harm index, while robbery, violence without injury, stalking, and harassment, homicide, and possession of weapons accounted for. So robbery was 5.3%, violence without injury was 5%, stalking, harassment was 3.7%, homicide was 3%, possession of weapon was 2.8% of the overall crime harm, respectively. Statistics with the offenses as the unit of analysis with a breakdown of solo versus non-solo offenses are presented. So males were 69% of violent offenders, while the females were 31%. There was no statistics on non-binary offenders. Importantly, males on average are responsible for 35% more harm than females. And offenders who were white British committed 74% of all violent crimes. However, due to the proportion of missing information, 17%, the analysis of ethnicity was discontinued at this point, which is bullshit. Because that's not even that high of, well, 17% is, if it was 20%, I would see, but I don't agree with that. Regarding age, offenders age between 16 and 21, which is definitely the age group at the University of Idaho. It's 18 to 21, 22. And the highest average harm per person with a score of which is followed by offenders of ages 21 to 25. I don't want to get too much heavy in the statistics. The pattern of reduced involvement in violence with age follows previous conceptualizations, but this is the first time the pattern is shown empirically using crime harm analysis, meaning that the younger adults are involved with these type of violent crimes. Prolific offending. We utilize conditional probability to understand prolific offenses over time. In Figure 1, it demonstrates an increasing likelihood of future offenses following a prior offense. In this context, violent crime offenders have a 39% likelihood of committing a second offense following the commission of their first offense. Following the second offense, the likelihood of committing a third offense increases to 55%, which I'm thinking of like hazing. If you hazed in your freshman year, it's going to get progressively worse by the time you're a senior. There is a consistent increase in the likelihood of future offenses thereafter, with a slight decrease after the commission of the 17th violent offense. 17th one? Geez, this trend fluctuates when offenders commit their 35th or subsequent consecutive offense, as there is a diminishing pool of offenders with such an extensive criminal history. These results provide an empirical basis for categorizing an offender as prolific if they have committed 3 or more offenses. Using this threshold, prolific offenders represent 21% of Dorset's violent offender population. More notably, prolific offenders are responsible for 55% of all accounted crimes and 53% of the total crime harm. This finding is consistent in every year in the data, with the exception of 2015 to 2016. Among the 3 offender categories of prolific offenders were mixed offenders, those who sometimes commit offenses with and sometimes without accomplices, strictly solo offenders and strictly co-offenders, respectively. Among prolific offenders, mixed offenders are active in 57% of all crimes and are responsible for 66% of all crime-related harm. Among non-prolific offenders, solo offending is the most common categorization. Regarding escalation, Figure 3 presents the average escalation of crime harm for each successive crime committed by a prolific offender. While the average crime rate fluctuates for each successive offense, the trend line demonstrates a steady decrease. As such, it appears that the harm committed by prolific offenders lessens with each successive offense. So comparing violent solo and co-offenders. Among the entire cohort of violent offenders, solo offenders represent 68% of all offenders, while mixed offenders and co-offenders represent 14% and 18% of all offenders, respectively. Importantly, solo offenders account for 53% of all counted crime, but 42% of all crime harm. In comparison, mixed offenders and co-offenders were jointly responsible for 47% of all counted crimes and 58% of all crime harm. So that's a higher rate. So with crime harm for solo offenders, mixed offenders, and co-offenders in each fiscal year of study. Mixed offenders and co-offenders, which is combined group offenders, committed 21 to 33% more violent crimes on average than solo offenders each year. As such, this combined group, which is numerically smaller than solo offenders, consistently commits more crimes on average. A similar pattern is observed for crime harm, as mixed offenders and co-offenders account for 45 to 60% of more crime harm than solo offenders each year. Notably, we see that offenders with solo offenders yield a significantly lower crime harm score than offenses committed in groups, as well as lower numbers of charges in each incident. Based on analysis of the felonious few, offenders responsible for a disproportionate ratio of crime counts or crime harm out of all the offenders in the dataset, we find greater concentrations in a smaller number of mixed offenders and co-offenders than among solo offenders. While 20% of solo offenders were responsible for 46% of the counted crimes, 20% of mixed offenders and co-offenders accounted for 55% of counted crimes. Similarly, 20% of solo offenders were responsible for 70% of crime harm, while 20% of mixed offenders and co-offenders counted for 78% of crime harm, which is over 100, so I don't know about that. The likelihood of becoming a future offender, well, that makes sense because they become solo and then become co-offenders, so that makes sense. So if they are solo at first, but then they end up becoming a part of a group and doing an offender, so you're going to have those type of imbalances. It's not going to equal 100% because you have people going into different groups. So the likelihood of becoming a future offender is higher among the combined non-solo offender group than among solo offenders. The data suggests that while the likelihood of committing a second violent offense is 31% among solo offenders, it rises to 57% in the combined offender group. Solo offenders do not reach a comparable probability until the fifth sequential offense, where the likelihood is 60%. Moreover, the likelihood of offense among combined group offenders is consistently higher than that of solo offenders in the first 14 offenses. The probability of a future offenses is less sporadic for combined group offenders than for solo offenders. So it becomes part of like a routine almost. Figure 6 represents the average harm for both solo and combined offenders for each sequential violent crime. As is evident, offenders in the combined group exhibit a higher average crime harm score for the majority of sequential offenses compared. Two solo offenders, nevertheless, both groups demonstrate a consistent decrease in crime harm for sequential offenses based on the trend lines, with fluctuations at specific points. So, co-offender networks of violent crime. So, Table 3 provides a social network statistics for the violent co-offending network in Dorset. The network appears to be notably diffused with a network density of less than 0.01. This suggests that the majority of Dorset's violent crime offenders do not co-offend or, at the very least, co-offend with a small number of co-offenders. This is reflected in both a degree of certainty and distance, where offenders have 0.67% co-offenders on average, or at least 12.1 nodes removed from one another. Moreover, 28,418 violent crime offenders are isolated, meaning they were solo offenders. Furthermore, 17% or 17.3% of offenders possessed a degree of centrality of 1, indicating they had a single co-offender, while 6.3%, 3.4%, and 1.8% and 1.1 offenders had a degree of centrality of 2, 3, 4, and 5, respectively. Only 0.3% offenders had 10 or more. Goodness. Finally, Pareto distributions for offenders, depicting the degree of centrality counted crimes and crime harm. Notably, 20% of the offenders account for 83% of co-offenders and are responsible for 53% and 78% of the counted crimes and crime harm, respectively. However, these variables are not mutually exclusive, as offenders are also in the top 20% of crime count and crime harm offenders, respectively. So, the basis is the offenders with the highest number of co-offenders committed the most violent crimes and generated the most crime harm. Among the top 100 offenders for crime count and crime harm, 75% and 83% respectively had at least one co-offender at some point in their criminal career. Among the top 1,000 offenders for crime count and crime harm, 62.7% and 62.1% respectively had at least one co-offender at some point in their criminal careers. Consequently, offenders with the highest crime counts and crime harm scores were rarely solo offenders. They frequently collaborated with other violent crime offenders. Indeed, while solo offenders average 1.7 crimes with an average crime score of 90, offenders who had one or more co-offenders averaged 3.1 with an average crime score of 144.2, which makes sense. Discussion. This study seeks to understand violent behavior patterns in co-offending networks by exploring the differences across various dimensions. We employ official statistics despite acknowledging the recognized concerns regarding external validity associated with these data, employing a population-level data set of violent crimes in Dorset, UK. We contribute to the body of evidence by applying a crime harm index analysis rather than a crime count approach, which provides insight into the dynamics of violent group offending. Previous studies have encountered obstacles when attempting to address the distinctive nature of offense severity due to the methods used to measure severity. Initially, studies exploring the potential compounding effect of offenses committed in groups of two or more often relied on qualitative assessments, generalized assessments such as mob mentality or terrorism, or a combination of both. Lance used broad violence categories to suggest that larger groups were prone to committing serious crimes, yet quantifying this disparity proved unfeasible. Until very recently, a nuanced approach to estimating variations in harm across offenders was absent. This gap has been filled with the introduction of crime harm or crime severity indices. Overall, the findings support the presence of a compounding effect of co-offending. Violent offenders endorse it with more than one connection to another violent offender. Those with a degree of centrality score of 2 or higher were identified to have a higher total and average harm score, 31% more harmful than average. The higher the number of connections, the higher the average crime count and crime harm. Overall, solo violent offenders account for less crime and crime harm compared to offenders who jointly commit crimes with others. Aligned with the findings of previous research in the UK, Canada, and the US, the evidence suggests that solo offenders, which would be considered the defendant, Bryan Kohberger, is a predominant career type. But prolific offenders were responsible for 55% of all counted crimes. Wait a minute. What did I say there? Solo violent offenders account for less crime and crime harm compared to offenders who jointly... Okay, so we're talking about solo violent offenders, which is not BK. Bryan Kohberger. Don't want to send any type of misinformation or disinformation out there. But prolific offenders were responsible for 55% of all counted crimes and 53% of all crime-related harm. Combined groups of offenders were responsible for 47% of all counted crimes and 58% of all crime-related harm. These figures are consistent on year-to-year basis. The literature further demonstrates that exposure to violence through co-offending or network relationships may increase the risk of violent behavior. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sources to support that. Our data suggests that the combination of co-offending group was responsible for 45 to 60% more crime harm on average compared to solo offenders across each year of study, and that offenders in the combined group were more likely to commit a second offense than solo offenders. Collectively, the evidence suggests an increased propensity for recidivism and more harmful instances of reoffending when violent crime is committed in groups. The greater the frequency of reoffending recorded, the higher the likelihood of another violent offense being documented, implying that conditional probability offers robust yet crude forecasting opportunities. And then you have to think about the ones who are in a group of 3 or more. You probably can have them branch out and doing violent crime as well together because of whatever reason, multiple reasons. So policy implications. The emphasis on co-offenders is not only theoretical, but also pragmatic. Conway and McCord, Anderson and Felsen, and Lance all concluded that intervention strategies should focus on co-offenders to effectively reduce recidivism. Police forces in the United Kingdom face mounting pressure to reduce violent crime. The Home Secretary has recently pledged over $130 million to combat serious violence, murder, and knife crime. Additionally, the UK government has encouraged a multi-agency public health approach following the 2018 publication of the Serious Violence Strategy. Combating violent crime is undeniably a clear priority. However, a smaller police force that do not receive the same level of financial investment as larger counterparts face significant obstacles. Therefore, directing attention towards co-offending networks appears to offer a potential fruitful path forward for police forces with limited financial resources, which makes sense. You go where there's isolated areas that have a high amount of crime, especially when it's co-offenders. A comprehensive understanding of the behavioral patterns within co-offending networks can lead to a substantial reduction in serious violence and victimization, as targeting certain key nodes in the network may help a ripple effect on their accomplices. Preventative deterrence messaging to prolific offenders and their co-offenders in the U.S. has proven effective, reducing crime by 21% among those directed directly targeted, and 15% across the total network, which I need to look those up. This aligns with Bailey's findings, which suggests that a knife crime prevention strategy in Thames Valley, UK, but more formal evaluations in the UK context are needed. Furthermore, the UK College of Policing provides the Approved Professional Practice (APP) guidelines for police forces in England and Wales to identify and manage the most serious sexual offenders and violent offenders. The majority of management occurs within multi-agency public protection settings and relies on prior convictions. However, the criteria for classifying an individual as potentially dangerous person, PDP, are somewhat more subjective. There is no specific legislation to define these individuals. Instead, it's based on reasonable grounds that they are likely to offend in the future, so it's not really specified. However, the PDP process should include offenders based on cumulative harm. If co-offending was also taken in consideration, the criterion for selecting offenders to be managed can potentially lead to further cumulative crime harm reduction. However, more research is needed to validate this approach under controlled settings where existing mechanisms to manage offenders should be prioritized for high harm, violent offenders with a propensity to co-offend with others. Very true. So the limitations, we'll just skim. Due to bias in reporting, not all violent incidences are reported to the police. Crimes are often underreported due to fear of retaliation, a lack of trust in the police, cultural barriers, and a belief that the police will not take any appropriate action, which definitely, I want to say, is definitely in this case that we are covering here at the Idaho 4. These underreported incidences constitute the dark figures or unknown instances of violence. Consequently, relying solely on police records provides an incomplete representation of the true prevalence of violence. And just to say real quickly, we learned about this crime because of Stacy Chapin, not because of a press conference. We advocate for studies to utilize additional data sources to expound on the compounding effect, though still considered implementing a crime harm index that is sensitive not only to the number of documented incidences, but also to the severity. Furthermore, even when incidences are reported, inconsistencies may arise in police documentation and classification of violent incidences. Very true, because they either don't report or don't do it correctly, or there's a plethora of reasons why. Discrepancies between jurisdictions can occur regarding what constitutes a violent crime and the criteria for recording an incident as such. This inconsistency in data collection practices can result in wide variations in the recorded statistics of violence, making it a challenge to compare or generalize findings across regions or time periods. Yes, we all have to be on the same board, do what they are doing, the APP, which is part of medical as well, having a standard policy and a procedure. Finally, the findings of this study pertain only to one police force in the UK and may be unique to Dorset. Therefore, replication of the findings would be necessary to determine whether similar levels of harm are observed in the prolific and combined offender groups across different contexts. Whew! So there you go. It's under an hour and a half, which isn't bad. It's one of the shorter videos I have done. Thank you all for being here. I do not know what the next video is going to be, but this empirical article really encompasses an understanding how co-offenders can escalate violence and up to even, they didn't talk about deaths. Well, they did talk about deaths, and it was a small portion of it. It was like 2% amongst the large population of crimes. But we learned that it's definitely within the time range of the offenders of the University of Idaho, and being the degree of separation, as well as having each other kind of feed off each other when it comes to violence. We heard on Linda Lane the altercation, which can escalate even more to what happened later on that evening or early in the morning. We learned how hazing is an escalation as well, and that takes multiple offenders to do that. So those are co-offenders working together. They're going to hear stories of previous and try to outdo or use their ideas for a current hazing, depending on the culture or those who are willing to participate. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining me. Let me know in the comments what you think about my moving on into a website where we'll have our videos. There's an ability for a chat, as well as more interaction between the people who listen to this channel and would like to know more about it on a personal level or on a small group level. I'm very excited in this direction. I feel like it's the way to go. And, we are kind of limited on YouTube, and it's all kind of been played out already. So trying something different for me and new. I don't know how many other channels are doing this, but I'm sure that if we start doing it, others will probably follow. So thank you all for being here. And until next time, see you then.